Hello, it's good to be back with you. In the very first lecture of this course, when we were talking about the value of sacred texts, I asked, if there were a fire in your home, which books, if any, would you try to save? As we continue our overview of Chinese scripture, I could ask another variant of that question. Which books, if any, would you consider being buried with? This was a real question in ancient China because many of the earliest versions we have of several important texts were recovered in the 20th century from tombs. For example, in 1973, 3 adjacent graves from the 2nd century BCE were excavated at Mawangdui, near the city of Jiangsha in Hunan province. Over 3,000 artifacts were discovered in those graves, including lacquerware and pottery and silk goods. And among them were several books that had been written on silk cloth. And that included the earliest copy of the Classic of Changes and, at that time, the 2 earliest versions of the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the key texts of Taoism and will be the subject of our lecture today. Okay, Taoism is sometimes spelled with a D and sometimes spelled with a T. The T is an older romanization. The sound has always been a D, so it's Taoism. After that excavation at Mawangdui, 20 years later, in 1993, another tomb was discovered in the village of Guodian in Hubei province that was dated to about 300 BCE. Inside were 804 bamboo slips on which were written an even older version of the Tao Te Ching, along with a chapter from the Records of Rites and some content from the Documents. Remember, those are 2 of the 5 Confucian classics. And if you're saying at this point, wait a minute, why would the same tomb have both Confucian and Taoist texts in it? Then you're asking the right sort of questions. I'll tell you the standard, commonly repeated story of Taoism first, and then I'll explain why scholars no longer think that story really works. The philosophy of Taoism was founded by a man referred to as Laozi, or Master Lao. His personal name was Li Dan, and he was an official in the archives of the state of Zhou and an older contemporary of Confucius. In fact, as the stories go, Confucius once traveled to consult with Laozi about the rites, and even though Laozi chastised Confucius for his arrogance and ambition, Confucius went away very impressed with his message about freedom and naturalness and living in accordance with the Tao, or the Way. After several years of teaching his ideas, Laozi became frustrated with conditions in China at the time, and he set out for the western regions beyond its borders. A gatekeeper there stopped him at the borders and begged him to put some of his ideas into writing before he went on, so that they wouldn't be entirely lost. Laozi thereupon wrote the Tao Te Ching, and that name means the Classic of the Way and its power. This is a relatively brief text of some 5,000 characters. And then Laozi continued on his way into the West and was never heard from again. Later students of Taoism, including Zhuangzi, adopted the ideas of Laozi and created a thriving philosophical school that competed fiercely with Confucianism. Okay, remember, I'm telling you sort of the traditional story still. Then after the fall of the Han Dynasty, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, when Confucianism declined, Taoism became more prominent. But in the process, it turned into a religion rather than a philosophy, complete with gods and rituals, a priesthood, and even a canon of scripture. As a native-born religion, Taoism provided a Chinese alternative to Buddhism. So educated Chinese continued to view Taoism primarily as a philosophy, but the common people were awed by its miracles and its ceremonies and spectacles of its religious practitioners. Okay, that's the familiar story, with the biographical details about Laozi's life taken from the Records of the Grand Historian, one of China's earliest histories, written about 100 BCE by Sima Qian. How much of that story stands up to scholarly scrutiny today? And the answer is, not much. There's no early independent verification of a person named Laozi. In fact, the name Laozi itself simply means the old master, which is a fairly generic pseudonym. The Tao Te Ching, and that's the text is referred to as the Laozi also, after the putative author. So the Tao Te Ching does indeed have about 5,000 characters, but it appears to be a collection of sayings and folk wisdom that accumulated over a couple of centuries, down to about 300 BCE. It's highly doubtful that it was written by just one individual, let alone by someone who was a contemporary of Confucius. Though, as we continue with this lecture, I'll occasionally refer to Laozi as a convenient fiction. I mean, that just sort of means the person or persons who were responsible for this text. The whole notion that there were distinct philosophical schools in pre-imperial China seems, like Laozi's biography, to be a Han Dynasty invention, where at that time, so maybe in the 1st century BCE, they read contemporary divisions back into the past. The records of the Grand Historian, that early Chinese history, includes an outline in an essay form that gives the basic beliefs of 6 schools: the Yin-Yang school, the Confucians, the Moists, who taught the importance of impartial caring, which is probably a better translation than universal love that's sometimes given, then the logicians, the legalists, and the Taoists. So at the time of Sima Qian, these were kind of the philosophical schools that were around, and then they tend to read those back into the past. In actuality, with the exception of the Moists, these were not organized social groups which claimed the exclusive allegiance of various thinkers. Instead, in the warring states period, before the Han Dynasty, the Qin and the Han Dynasty, there was an eclectic mix of ideas, with all sorts of people talking about the way, the Tao, and the complementary forces of yin and yang, even though, in retrospect, we might classify some of those as Taoist and others as Confucian. Taoists and Confucians were not bitter rivals in early China, which is why their texts now show up in some of the same tombs. And I'm not sure that teachers whom we today regard as Taoist would have used that term to describe themselves. During the Han Dynasty, and remember that goes from 202 BCE to 220 of CE, there emerged a sense of what Taoists believe, which apparently involved a whole lot of borrowing. So according to that philosophical essay in the records of the Grand Historian, it describes the Taoists as follows. It says, "The Taoists teach men to live a life of spiritual concentration and to act in harmony with the unseen. Their teaching is all-sufficient and embraces all things. Its method consists in following the seasonal order of the Yin-Yang school, selecting what's good from the Confucian and Moist teachings, and adopting the important points of the logical and legalist schools. It modifies its position with the times, and it responds to the changes which come about in the world. In establishing customs and practices and administering affairs, it does nothing that is not appropriate to the time and place. Its principles are simple and easy to practice. It undertakes few things, but achieves many successes." So you can see that the idea there, at least from the author of that essay, is that the Taoists managed to bring in all the good things from the other schools and put them into one, and then put that in harmony with the changes of the seasons or the cosmos. With the canonization of the 5 Confucian classics in the Han Dynasty, there came a need to establish, preserve, and transmit authoritative versions of texts exactly. Okay. And when I use the word canonization, that's just an approximate term here. The selection of texts came not from a church council, but by government fiat, when the 5 classics were made the core of the official state curriculum in 136 BCE. But as we saw with Confucianism, our modern Western categories of philosophy versus religion don't quite apply in ancient China. Thinkers with Taoist tendencies addressed political problems, ethical matters, and speculated about the nature of reality. Yet at the same time, they offered a path to transcendence and an escape from worldly concerns through meditation and spiritual disciplines. And as for the relationship between Laozi and Zhuangzi, remember Zhuangzi is supposed to be the second most prominent early Taoist, or the supposed distinction between popular religious Taoism and the philosophical Taoism of the educated elite, I'll be critiquing those assumptions as well in this and in the next lecture. But the place to begin is with the Tao Te Ching. As I mentioned earlier, the Tao Te Ching was originally known as the Laozi. Though its origins are much older, the standard text was established in the 3rd century of the Common Era in a commentary by Wang Bi, who also wrote a very important commentary on the Classic of Changes. And then he died at the age of 23. Imagine writing 2 classic commentaries while still a fairly young man. The Laozi consists of 2 parts of roughly equal length, known as the Tao Jing, so that's the Classic of the Way, and that's chapters 1 through 37, and then the De Jing, that's the Classic of Power, or the Classic of Virtue, and those are chapters 38 to 81. Hence, when you put those 2 parts together, then it becomes the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is relatively short, with each of its 81 chapters taking up only a page or 2, so you can easily read it in an afternoon. It's written in a terse, almost cryptic style. Some of it rhymes, and there are striking images, and the whole thing is wonderfully suggestive. It seems like it means so much, even when it's difficult to put one's finger on exactly what's going on. The combination of brevity and profundity has made it irresistible to commentators and translators. There are over 350 Chinese commentaries that are extant, although at least twice that many are thought to have been written at some point, and there are now over 300 translations into English. In fact, the Tao Te Ching is probably the best-known work of Chinese culture. It's been translated into more times, into more languages than any other book in history aside from the Bible. And those translations have often markedly been different from each other. Fortunately, as Angus Graham, a prominent scholar of early Chinese thought, has observed, the Laozi is a rare case of a poem which, for readers in tune with it, seems to work even through the feeblest translations, and no one who has glimpsed a coherence in its imagery has altogether failed to understand it. The overriding concern of the Tao Te Ching is the Tao, or the Way, which is a transcendent order underlying all of phenomena. It's somehow connected with nature as opposed to human artifice, but ultimately it's beyond words, since language is, after all, a human artifact. The paradox of describing the indescribable shows up in the very first lines. So the Tao Te Ching begins by saying, "A way that can be followed is not a constant way. A name that can be named is not a constant name. Nameless, it's the beginning of heaven and earth. Named, it's the mother of the myriad creatures." But a translation doesn't quite capture the entire meaning, since in Chinese, words can function both as nouns and as verbs, at least in classical Chinese. So the word Tao means a way or a teaching, but it can also be used as a verb to mean to follow or to talk about. So the first line is Dao ke Dao, the Tao that can be Taoed, Fei Chang Dao is not the constant Tao. Or another translation has, the Tao that can be told is not the invariant Tao. What else might be said about the Way or the Tao? According to the Tao Te Ching, it's eternal and inexhaustible. It's also the origin of all things. So chapter 25 says, "A thing was formed murkily. She was generated before heaven and earth. Silent and vast, unique she stands and does not change. She turns full circle and is not used up. She can be the mother of the world. I do not know her name. I entitle her the Way." Okay, this particular translator has chosen to use feminine pronouns, which makes some sense. The Tao is often compared to a mother or has some feminine characteristics. Yet that isn't quite right either, since the Tao encompasses oppositions such as male and female, or weak and strong, empty and full, beautiful and ugly. Everything finds a place within the Tao, which does not value things according to human standards or discriminate between things according to human ways of thought. Chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching says this: "The whole world recognizes the beautiful as the beautiful, yet this is only the ugly. The whole world recognizes the good as the good, yet this is only the bad. Thus, something and nothing produce each other. The difficult and easy complement each other. The long and short offset each other. High and low incline toward each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore, the sage keeps to the deed that consists in taking no action and practices the teaching that uses no words. Did you catch that? Those last lines there? A deed that takes no action and a teaching that doesn't use words. The Tao Te Ching is a book of wisdom, and Lao Tzu's advice is, if you want to live peacefully and fully, you need to bring your thoughts and deeds into harmony with the Tao. Or rather, you should avoid overthinking and practice wu, and wu is a term that means non-action, or perhaps a better translation would be effortless action. The goal is to act spontaneously. They use the word ziran, doing what comes naturally, without trying to force a situation one way or the other. So in chapter 10, we read, attain utmost emptiness, maintain steadfast tranquility, be like heaven and merge with the Tao. One with the Tao, you will last long. You may die, but will never perish. Along the way, the Tao Te Ching upends common assumptions. It might be beneficial or even preferable to adopt more stereotypically feminine characteristics, things like deference and quietude and passiveness, even in circumstances where traditionally masculine virtues hold sway, like politics. Lao Tzu, or the Book of the Lao Tzu, says, be wary of ambition, desires, and possessions. So much of the Tao Te Ching is directed toward rulers, and Lao Tzu informs them that rather than forceful leadership and conquest, a small state with an unobtrusive government might in the end yield better results and may indeed last longer. At a time of incessant conflict, so this is during the Warring States period, which is an apt name for that time in Chinese history, a ruler who kept out of the limelight and avoided direct confrontation might fare better than one who was eager to lead his people into battle. Chapter 17. The best of ancient kings were in their kingdoms hardly known. Next best, were the patriarchs loved and widely praised. Next again, those that the people feared. And then last, so the worst, come those whose abuses they endured. Think about what that means. The best kings are those that the people are hardly even aware of. Chapter 57. The more taboos and prohibitions there are in the world, the poorer the people will be. The more sharp weapons the people have, the more troubled the state will be. The more cunning and skill man possesses, the more vicious things will appear. The more laws and orders are made prominent, the more thieves and robbers will be. Therefore, the sage says, I take no action, and the people of themselves are transformed. I love tranquility, and the people of themselves become correct. I engage in no activity, and the people of themselves become prosperous. I have no desires, and the people of themselves become simple. Again, you see that notion of wu or non-action in practice, as if you could practice non-action. The Tao Te Ching is a rich, fascinating text that frequently employs paradoxes to make its points, which means that it can't really be skimmed. It has to be read slowly, many times, as one starts to intuit its deeper meanings. A couple more favorite passages. From chapter 38. The person of superior integrity does not insist upon his integrity. For this reason, he has integrity. The person of inferior integrity never loses sight of his integrity, and for this reason, he lacks integrity. Or from chapter 9, stretch a bow, right, to the very full, and you'll wish you had stopped in time. Temper a sword edge to its sharpest, and you'll find it soon grows dull. When bronze and jade fill your hall, it can no longer be guarded. Wealth and place breed insolence that brings ruin in its train. When your work is done, then withdraw. Such is heaven's way. And finally, one more passage that combines cosmology, self-cultivation, government, and the key concepts of the feminine and effortless action and insight, while paradoxically advocating weakness and disparaging learning. And I think learning in this case probably means book learning, the kind of things that Confucians are good at. So you got all that together? Chapter 10. In preserving the soul and embracing the one, can you avoid departing from them? In concentrating your qi, okay, remember qi is vital energy, as in Neo-Confucian philosophy. In concentrating your qi and arriving at utmost weakness, can you be like an infant? In cleansing and purifying your profound insight, can you be without fault? In loving the people and governing the state, can you be without knowledge? In the opening and closing of the gates of heaven, can you play the role of the female? In understanding all within the four reaches, can you do nothing? And that's that wu-wei. If you find this way of speaking and thinking intriguing, then you really should read the whole Tao Te Ching. It's fun, it's engaging, but don't force yourself. That would defeat the whole purpose. Do what comes naturally. Follow the Tao. For nearly 2 millennia, the Chinese have read and savored the Tao Te Ching, and they've wanted to attribute its wisdom to a historical sage named Elytz, much like Jews credited Moses as the author of the Pentateuch, or Hindus imagined Vyasa to be the creator of the Mahabharata, that very long epic poem. Yet modern scholars have had serious doubts. The Tao Te Ching seems to be a jumble of proverbs, paradoxes, observations, and advice, with frequent repetitions and disjunctions. It appears to have started as an oral compilation of aphorisms that were added to and rearranged over time, something like the biblical book of Proverbs, maybe, and then eventually were attributed to the old master, to Elytz, or since that Chinese term can be plural as well as singular, it might be the old masters or the elders. Eventually, a version of this memorized wisdom tradition was written down in the late 4th century. The oldest extant copy, as I noted earlier, was found in a tomb at Guodian in 1993 and dated to about 300 BCE. It's recognizably the Tao Te Ching that we know today, but it's only about 40% of the current text, with material from just 31 of the 81 current chapters. And the individual sayings are not in the same order. So then we have a puzzle. Is the Guodian text a selection of someone's favorite lines from a more complete work? Or is it an earlier version that was added to later? Or is it an alternative version? Perhaps there were several similar compilations that were circulating at the time. It's hard to say, but it certainly doesn't look like something that was written in close to its final form by a contemporary of Confucius. That old traditional story doesn't really hold up to the evidence that we've been uncovering in China in the 20th century. 2 somewhat later copies were found at Mawangdui in 1973, dated to 200 BCE and 170 BCE. Those versions are quite close to the standard 3rd century CE text of Wang Bi, although they have some varied characters and a few more grammatical particles, which clarify some of the ambiguous passages. They also have different chapter divisions, and most curiously, the order of the 2 major sections is reversed. So in those 2 versions, they start with what today we have as chapters 38 to 81, that's the De Jing, which tend to be a little more politically oriented, and then they conclude with our current chapters of 1 through 37, the Dao Jing. So one might refer to that early version as the De Dao Jing. I don't know that this makes a huge difference in interpretation, but it might. Think of how concluding the Hebrew Bible with the book of Chronicles gives it a very different feel from the Christian Old Testament, which ends with the prophet Malachi. But as interesting as such archaeological finds are to textual scholars, historians have been anxious to understand the role of the Tao Te Ching in Chinese culture. For his 2 volumes of Taoist classics in the 19th century Sacred Books of the East series, James Legge, remember he's the Victorian translator, the missionary, he translated both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, a longer prose work supposedly written by a 4th century BCE philosopher by that name. Ever since, Westerners have read the works of Laozi and Zhuangzi together as the foundational texts of Taoism. And the Chinese themselves have considered Zhuangzi to have been an early follower of Laozi at least since the Han Dynasty. But then again, that assumption has not held up under close scrutiny. The Zhuangzi is definitely worth reading. It's a spectacular work of literature and philosophy, with dazzling rhetoric and funny stories and wild flights of fancy and arresting insights that challenge our ordinary ways of thinking. It's actually one of my favorite books ever. there's certainly some overlap between the ideas in the Zhuangzi and the ideas in the Tao Te Ching. Zhuangzi writes about the Tao and about spontaneous action. He praises perfected persons, as he calls them, who have transcended the physical and social constraints of ordinary life, and he's skeptical of human judgments and limited perspectives. He asks, for example, how do I know that loving life is not a delusion? How do I know that in hating death, I'm not like a man who, having left home in his youth, has forgotten his way back? Zhuangzi is perhaps most famous for dreaming that he was a butterfly and then waking up and being unsure as to whether he wasn't now a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. Yet there are also stark differences between Zhuangzi and Laozi. Zhuangzi rejects political activity outright, whereas Laozi often gives advice to rulers. Zhuangzi doesn't talk about non-action or wu-wei, and he doesn't urge the adoption of stereotypically feminine qualities. Before the Han Dynasty, no one thought to categorize Zhuangzi and Laozi in the same philosophical school. And in fact, far from seeing Zhuangzi as a disciple of Laozi, modern scholars believe that Zhuangzi probably came first. His core writings preceded the compilation of the Tao Te Ching. Okay, the phrase core writings should have caught your attention. The text of the Zhuangzi, as it exists today, was put together by a scholar named Guo Xiang, who died in 312 CE. It consists of 33 chapters, which seem to have accumulated over several centuries. Scholars have identified 5 different philosophical perspectives. That of the Zhuangzi, so this is the core text, chapters 1 through 7, and then his followers later on, chapters 16 through 27 and 32. The primitivists, who were opposed to government, luxury, and technology, in ways that are perhaps reminiscent of the Tao Te Ching, always looking for simplicity. Those are chapters 8 through 10. And then a group that we call the syncretists, who are responsible for 11 through 15, and then 33, which also is a kind of survey of all of the philosophical schools at the time. And then the hedonists, who are just interested in selfish pleasure, in doing the best for themselves, not so interested in society. And those chapters are 28 through 31 of the Zhuangzi. So the Zhuangzi is a very complicated text with all of these different strands in it. I realize that this starts to sound like the documentary hypothesis and the Torah. Remember those 4 strands of J, E, P, and D that got put together and then edited over time. But things are hardly ever simple when you're dealing with sacred texts. My basic point is that you should read the Zhuangzi. It has been very influential in Asian culture, particularly in Zen Buddhism, and it's been justly celebrated in the West. But be wary of claims that Zhuangzi is the second most important Taoist philosopher. I'm not sure that he would have considered himself a Taoist. And the distinction between philosophy and religion is not all that clear in ancient China. And although some Taoists have enjoyed the Zhuangzi, others have recognized other texts as much more important within the Taoist tradition. Maybe one more story from the Zhuangzi. It's said that Zhuangzi was once fishing somewhere, which is a good Taoist kind of thing to do, and officials came from the state of Chu, and they invited him to come and serve there as a prime minister. It's a great honor to be invited to do so. And Zhuangzi thought for just a minute, and he said, I've heard in the state of Chu that there's a sacred tortoise, which is kept in a lacquer box, and the tortoise is 3,000 years old. It's sort of mummified there. And he asked these messengers that came, do you think that tortoise would rather be honored and taken care of that way in the court of Chu, or would it rather be alive and wagging its tail in the mud? And the messenger said, probably alive. And Zhuangzi said, okay, out with you. We're done. I would rather stay here and wag my tail in the mud. In any case, the Zhuangzi doesn't have nearly the stature of the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching really did become sacred scripture for many. During the late Han Dynasty, so this is from the 2nd to the 3rd centuries of the Common Era, Laozi came to be regarded as an immortal, a cosmic deity, and a savior of humankind. It was even said that after he left China and headed west, he went to India, where he taught a simplified version of Taoism that was more appropriate for the Indians, and that became known as Buddhism later on. So So some Taoists have claimed that Lao Tzu himself was the Buddha in India. Not true, but something that made them feel better about Buddhism coming in from the West and being a foreign religion or a foreign philosophy, when they said, no, it actually has Chinese origins. Similarly, reciting the Tao Te Ching became a devotional exercise after the fall of the Han Dynasty with magical properties. Around 500 in the Common Era, the Zheng Gao, and those are declarations of the perfected. We'll talk more about this text in the next lecture. But the Zheng Gao reported the story of a father and his two sons who were instructed by a certain old lord to recite the Tao Te Ching as sort of a religious practice. The father and the elder brother made it to 10,000 times. As I said, it's not a very long text. So they recited it 10,000 times, and then they flew off as immortals. The younger son, however, only made it to 9,733 repetitions, and so died a regular death. The Tao Te Ching is a text that, even if it won't guarantee you immortality for reciting it 10,000 times, will nevertheless enrich your life and show you new ways of thinking about the Tao, about nature, and about our existence here.